So I'm a little more optimistic than David. I'm often accused of being a climate Pollyanna, and so we'll see how that goes. And my presentation follows very nicely from David. So Vivian started us off yesterday with the question of who's talking to whom about what. And what David gave a really nice presentation of is the what part of that. Sort of what is the imaginary that these kind of transnational networks are talking about. And what I'm going to talk a little bit today is the who's talking to whom and the networked nature of transnational climate governance. Because there's two things I really know about climate governance. One is the stability and futility of the multilateral process. Right? If the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting something different, then the multilateral climate process has been insane for about the last 10 years. Right? We've seen no structural change in how we go about the process of negotiating, and we've seen no change in the interests of the major players. Right? Given those things, no structural change, no change in the interest, how can we possibly expect to get an actual comprehensive multilateral solution to climate change? Right? Now, the reason I'm not jumping off a bridge because of this is because concurrently to this deadlock and stalemate in the multilateral process, as David showed and is stuff that we've both worked on, has been the emergence of a different system of governance. What I call the experimental system of governance, what this project that David and I worked on with Harriet, we talk about as the transnational climate governance system, right? That essentially brings out, or essentially a number of different kinds of actors, cities, states and provinces, corporations and NGOs, community groups, working across borders in many cases, have emerged to take responsibility for climate change themselves, to try and seize authority over this issue, to govern it. Right? But they're governing it in a very different way than the multilateral process. Now, partly that's because it's small scale. Right? Some of these are relatively large. My favorite one here is EdenBee, which is essentially Facebook for climate geeks. It's a very small scale way of governing climate change, up through RGGI and the Climate Group and C40 cities, which have about 40% of or C40 cities claim that they have about 20% of the global emissions that is somehow connected to the economic activity of the cities that are in that network, right? And so you have a very wide range. And so what I want to talk to you about today is the nature and impact of this kind of experimental governance. So David gave some of the overview of it, and so I'm not going to talk that much about that, but I do want to talk about especially the networked nature of this governance and how it is a fundamentally different form of governance than the multilateral process. And then I'm going to ask a little bit about whether it can have an impact and whether that imaginary has collapsed. Right? So first, on the nature of it. One of the things, and one of the reasons I'm a little bit more optimistic that it hasn't collapsed yet, is that unlike the multilateral process that has been basically a singular focus, right? The multilateral process is focused almost exclusively on the reduction of emissions. And that is the problem of climate change. How do you distribute emission reductions? Which is essentially the problem of distributing costs. Distributing costs is not a popular thing, and doing it at the multilateral level is very difficult, right? What's going on in the experimental system, though, right, is that instead of a singular focus, governance, collectively speaking, is reorienting the understanding of climate change, or the global response to climate change, by treating it as a much larger and multifaceted problem of decarbonization. I think David's absolutely right that the techno-market imaginary is part of that, right, and a key part of that. But part of the techno-market imaginary, or what we might call liberal environmentalism, and my colleague Stephen Bernstein calls liberal environmentalism, is the notion that climate change is a huge problem, which ironically gives all kinds of opportunities to enter that problem in different ways, to enter it through energy efficiency, to enter it through small-scale local action on smart grids, to enter it through problems of corporate and NGO alliances, right? And so this experimental system serves to reorient the response to climate change around decarbonization, which I think actually brings together the techno-market imaginary and the sustainable living imaginary, right? And so these experiments undertake a host of activities, from capacity building in terms of measuring carbon, doing action planning, thinking about land use, to to technological diffusion in terms of smart grids and transport, energy efficiency, renewables, and also the development of carbon markets. Along with that, there are a number of these experiments that also contribute to discourses around sustainable living. Right? And so they're getting to work on multiple dimensions of decarbonization, which in some ways makes the climate governance experiment process more resilient to the kind of economic shocks that David's talking about, and have to no doubt slow the momentum of climate governance in both this respect and the multilateral respect. Second, I think it's really important to note that this is decentralized and bottom-up, but it is organized. There is no central organizer of this kind of activity. No one's saying go out. There's no central authority that's saying go experiment with climate change, right? But that doesn't mean that there aren't patterns in how this process plays out, right? And one of them is what David pointed out, that they seem to have across the board the same worldview, right? Liberal environmentalism, the techno markets, right? And so what you have here, you have to remember that I call these things experiments, but in many respects they are not revolutionary, right? They are, in many respects, upholding the same view of the nature-society relationship, the win-win discourse that we see in most environmental governance, right? But they are experimental, or they are different in terms of how they approach climate change and how governance works. I could talk about other ways that they are self-organized in Q&A if people are interested. But I want to focus on the networked nature of the experimental system, right? Because, again, this is a system of governance in that it is patterned and has links that are growing up between experiments. I want to talk about experimental governance as networked governance in a couple of different ways. First, we can talk about experiments as networks, right? And so one of the key kinds of networks that you find, or key kinds of experiments that you find in this system, are city networks, for instance. And this is a relatively poor map of the C40 cities, which is a group of the 40 largest cities in the world who have all decided to get together and coordinate their actions on climate change. Right? And so one way we can think about networked governance in climate change is that these initiatives themselves are networks. Right? That what you have is, with relatively less centralized control than you find in other governance approaches, you have groups of actors getting together working towards a common set of goals, right? And so most of the experiments that I examine, whether it's C40, whether it's the Cities for Climate Protection, whether it's the Climate Group, could be classified as networks of actors, right? But to say they're networks is also to say that one of their key functions is networking. Right? And so both the form and function of individual experiments is network governance. And this is a quote from the CEO of the Climate Group, and I think this is a really key example of how this kind of network governance works. Right? And so when I say that it's network governance, what I mean is that the key governance mechanisms are networking, whether it be linking actors, something as simple as the network of 2 degrees, which brings together professionals in a digital setting who are working on climate change across the world. Whether it's best practice exchange, like you see in the Cities for Climate Protection. Whether it's mutual support, like we have here, an example of the Climate Group. Right? One of the great things about the Climate Group, or one of the things that they tout about themselves, I should say, is that they're able to bring together corporate and subnational actors to move forward on climate change. And one of the best examples of this that I came across in my research was when the Climate Group worked with Cisco on deploying smart grid technology in cities. Right? And so Cisco essentially faced a business case problem. Right? They had some off-the-shelf technology to build smart grids that they thought would be really good for cities, both in terms of climate change and in terms of making cities more efficient. Right? They couldn't sell it to cities, right? Because cities said, well, yeah, we would be interested in smart grids, right, and smart transportation systems, but we don't know if it's going to work. And so you had the classic chicken and egg problem where you couldn't make a demand case for this technology unless cities started to buy it, but cities weren't going to start to buy it until it was clear that it was going to work. And so the demand depended upon there being demonstrations that it would work. Cisco started working with the climate group to engage their subnational government members in large-scale pilot projects such that they could then show that the demand case was real. Right? And this kind of mutual dependence or mutual support is a key part of networked governance in the experimental system. Right? But we can also go beyond thinking about individual initiatives as network governance to think about networks of experiments. And this is a graphic from my 2011 book on climate governance experiments that essentially lays out all of the actors, or most of them, that are involved in the development of voluntary carbon markets, voluntary carbon credits. Right? So essentially with the carbon markets, especially voluntary carbon markets, you had to create a market essentially from scratch. There was no commodity. Right? Not emitting carbon dioxide is not a very tangible commodity. You have to create that commodity pretty much from scratch. And essentially what emerged as soon as the notion of these voluntary carbon markets became part of the key or part of the discussions around climate governance is a series of experiments to fill these niches in the carbon market cycle, in the carbon market ecology. Right? And so when you have offset consumers, people that need to buy offsets either to fulfill corporate social responsibility or to fulfill regulations that they have, or just because they feel like offsetting their carbon footprints. Essentially, what that set in motion was the development of a series of other actors that had to be in place to make that happen. So you had to have people that were going to produce the offsets, but that's not enough. Right? So you have a series of intermediaries that essentially measure and verify that carbon offsets are being created. And then on the outside here, you have to have a bunch of other actors that essentially are different kinds of accountants, right, that show that those offsets are real. And in the voluntary sector, all of this is happening through experiments. All of this is happening through non-governmental activity. All of this is happening through subnational activity. Another way we can look at this is there's a cluster of experiments that work on, you can't read that. There's a cluster of experiments that work on cities and deploying technology in cities. And so I found a series of them that all are working in this same area. And what's interesting here is that relationships of competition, cooperation, and mutual dependence are emerging within the experimental system. And so this network governance, these relationships that are developing amongst experiments, is essentially shaping how this response to climate change is going on. Right? And what's key really is this fourth column that you can't read talks about how all of these experiments that are essentially independent and working on deploying climate-friendly technology in cities, how they are linked to all these other experiments. So for instance, C40, which I talked about, is linked to the Connected Urban Development Program, which is run by Cisco, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the Clinton Climate Foundation. So essentially, relationships amongst experiments are shaping how this experimental governance system works. Do one more example. I'll do this picture instead. Right? This is a picture of the carbon markets. Right? You wouldn't really know that because essentially what this is the individuals who've been working on the design of various carbon market schemes. Right? And so we did a little bit of social network analysis to try and understand what's the underlying network that is linking together things like the WCI, like RGGI, like the EU ETS. And it turns out there's a relatively small number of people that work across these things. Right? And so another way to think about the networked governance is that we don't have, and what's fascinating to me about this picture is this is just a bunch of people, and the only reason they're on this map is because they've attended design meetings at different venues. And just from looking at who's attended meetings with whom, what emerges is, well, here's RGGI, here's the WCI, these are some early economists, this is Kyoto, this is the UK, and this is the EU. Right? And so you get this distinct emergence of these venues by just looking at the network of individuals and who's working together. Right? And so again, What we have in the experimental system is a set of initiatives that are networks themselves, and we have a set of initiatives that are networked. And this kind of bottom-up, decentralized, yet patterned approach to climate governance is what I think is now ascendant and dominant in the global response to climate change. This is just another picture of it. But of course, that does not mean that it's doing anything. Right? And this is where I tend to agree with David, and this is why I do think about jumping off bridges sometimes. Right? So this is my favorite quote from the book I did in 2011 from Transition Towns, which is an experiment in my database. We have a thing called the cheerful disclaimer, which means we have no idea if the idea is going to work or not. It's an invitation to have a go. Right? So the question is, right? Sure, we've got the emergence of all this kind of activity. There's a lot of dynamism, right? But does dynamism equal forward movement? And that really is the question at hand, right? So let me say, do I have a couple, like 2 more minutes, or am I done?
2 minutes.
I can do 2 minutes. So that really is the question at hand. And what I would argue is that if we try and measure this by carbon reductions, we're measuring it in the wrong way, right? What we need to measure the impact of these experiments on is whether they have catalytic impact, whether they contribute to the building of political and economic coalitions that push for broader action. If you have cities that engage smart grids, does that change the political and economic calculus in other places that makes national action more palatable? If you then can, because this is the way that you can start to break that logjam at the multilateral level, such that we can change one aspect of the negotiations, either the structure or the major interests, or the interests of the major players.